Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a really intriguing and somewhat unusual study that could change everything, kind of. Mostly because of the topic it deals with and the potential implications from this discovery. But the thing is, I actually had no idea this paper was even out, mostly because this is not one of those topics or themes or, I guess, scientific fields that I generally cover on the channel. But in this case, some of you wonderful people sent me several messages asking me to cover this because this does have huge implications for us, humans, our consciousness. Because it discovers something super important for a somewhat kind of a fringe idea proposed a few decades ago by the famous Roger Penrose, the idea of quantum consciousness. Okay, let's actually, I guess, take it very slowly, step by step, because there are a lot of super complex topics that we first need to cover. But first, here's the study. Ultraviolet superradiance from mega networks of tryptophan in biological architectures. And so in this particular study, the researchers discovered something really unusual by building a network out of a protein known as tryptophan. And that something starts to produce quantum effects. And there's a really important reason why this is kind of crucial. But to understand all of this, let's I guess go back a few decades when the famous Nobel laureate Roger Penrose proposed something that a lot of people thought was maybe a little bit too much, or a little bit too eccentric. Now, Penrose is obviously a really good mathematician, and he's an excellent physicist, but in this proposition he was dealing with ideas from, I guess, neuroscience and philosophy. And here he tried to explain consciousness, the origin of consciousness, by trying to bring in quantum mechanics, but also mixing this with his field of study in general relativity, quantum superposition, and even space-time curvatures. And so he essentially proposed that our brain is able to produce quantum states inside that are then collapsed by things like, for example, gravity, because these states become unstable, with these quantum waves collapsing into one of possible states, with the object of much greater mass, so for example our brain, very likely going through these collapses much faster. Or I guess just to rephrase this, he proposed that our brains contain a lot of these quantum states at all times. And so here we're talking about that Schrödinger's cat that's both alive and dead at the same time, with the brain acting like some kind of a quantum orchestra and not really a classical computer, which is what's usually assumed by a lot of neuroscientists and even a lot of computer scientists. And so here this consciousness that's very difficult to define originates as a sort of a quantum superposition inside individual neurons, and is not really the result of neural connections at all. And as a result of this, he then even argued that consciousness by itself can never actually appear inside various computer models, and is technically non-algorithmic, being entirely quantum in nature. So a classical Turing machine or a classical computer could never actually reach consciousness, or basically according to him, all of those language models that some scientists thought might have become conscious could never become that. But this unusual view was basically criticized by everyone. Neuroscientists, computer scientists, artificial intelligence researchers, and they pretty much all disagreed. Mostly because, first of all, there was no evidence, it was all just based on his propositions, but second of all, for one very important reason. Quantum states are very difficult to produce. For example, this Quantum System 1 by IBM used to be one of the most powerful quantum computers out there, and it actually requires close to absolute zero temperatures and has to be isolated from the environment in order to avoid the collapse of these quantum waves. And so back in the days, back in 1999, a researcher even calculated that in a typical brain environment, if there was a quantum wave, it would most likely collapse in a tiny fraction of a second, something like 10 to the minus of 13 seconds, way too fast to be significant for any type of consciousness, or for any type of neural processes. And that's because brains are very hot and they contain a lot of stuff inside, making these quantum waves practically impossible. And so for many years his idea was kind of ignored. But then someone else read his book and actually added his own ideas. This is Stuart Hameroff, a professor at University of Arizona who specialized in anesthesiology. So yeah, that stuff you get before a surgery. And he proposed something that Penrose never thought about, and something that potentially provides physical explanation for how this quantum consciousness is even possible. And as you'll learn today, it might even have physical evidence based on various studies. But obviously you might be asking yourself, anesthesiology? What does this have to do with anything? Well, here's the thing. when it comes to defining consciousness, even today we have no idea what it is. Because there are philosophical definitions, there are biological definitions, there are psychological definitions, and they all seem to differ. But one of the best definitions comes from medicine. It's usually assessed as a combination of verbal behavior, various types of brain activity, and of course the idea of arousal, or being aware. And that's obviously something we can measure. And by definition, anesthesiology is usually an attempt to remove this so that the patient doesn't wake up and does not feel anything. And so there's actually an intriguing connection between anesthesiology and the idea of consciousness. Although when it comes to consciousness definitions, in humans we normally base it on verbal reports, so basically being able to communicate that you're conscious, which is of course why those language models used by various artificial intelligence scientists were kind of able to fool everyone into thinking that they were conscious. They're probably not. Or in animals, we often assess this by using what's known as the self-awareness test. It usually involves a mirror and placing something on, for example, the face of the animal. In a lot of cases, animals like, for example, great apes, by seeing something in the mirror on their face, will actually try to scratch it off or remove it, understanding that they're looking at themselves. But in a lot of other cases, like for example in most dog cases, most dogs don't actually see anything and don't care. Now some do react, just not all of them. But here it does not mean that the dogs are not conscious. It just means that consciousness is just very difficult to measure, or to even define. As a matter of fact, according to Wikipedia, there are over 20 different individual models of consciousness, all proposed in the last few decades, and all with a lot of evidence and a lot of experiments, including a lot of explanations for how all of this works. And though some of them are quite philosophical, or maybe difficult to prove, quite a lot of them are based on neuroscience that does provide us with physical evidence. You can find this in the link in the description. But overall, even today, in 2024, there is no one definition that everybody agrees with. So basically consciousness, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for like thousands of years now, still has no definition, no explanation, and we still know very little about it. But this particular study might take us a little bit closer, assuming that it's correct. Okay, so back to Stuart Hameroff. So because his research was in anesthesiology, he actually discovered something somewhat strange. He discovered that a lot of different anesthetics, so basically things we use to induce anesthesiology or to induce this state of unconsciousness, tend to be very strange gases that don't make sense and should not act on neurons. For example, a lot of different noble gases or inert gases such as xenon, krypton, and argon for some reason have anesthetic properties. Here's one of the papers about xenon anesthesia. But these gases are generally inert, they don't actually chemically act with anything, and so the actual mechanism of anesthesia here is actually somewhat difficult to explain. And so a few decades back, he proposed an intriguing idea. He realized that maybe all of this is actually the result of interaction between tryptophan rings and various chemical compounds. And you might have heard of tryptophan before. It's one of the most common amino acids that's usually used in the synthesis of many different proteins. And for some reason, it also absorbs UV light. It's also fluorescent, or basically it can emit light if it receives a certain photon. And more importantly, it can sometimes form complex structures that eventually form rings. And it's really the formation of these unusual rings or these strange tunnels that could be responsible for everything. And so here Hameroff proposed that anesthesia works through the interaction with these unusual microtubules when certain anesthetics, such as for example xenon, bind to various tubulin molecules, occupying them inside, which then changes the frequency of vibration that a lot of these structures produce naturally. And so in a nutshell, his proposition was really simple. The main reason we become unconscious during anesthesia is because various molecules bind to this unusual tubulin, disrupting its natural vibrations and thus somehow making us unconscious. And though this might sound maybe a little bit far-fetched, there is something really important to understand here. These unusual tubulins are literally everywhere inside of us. Okay, a brief side note about microtubules. And so even though we're technically talking about tryptophan, one of the things that tryptophan is able to produce is also known as tubulin, an unusual protein that can then form these very, very long structures known as tubules, or technically microtubules. And if you've ever taken microbiology class of any kind, you probably remember that these structures are literally everywhere. Their main function is basically structure. This is a type of a skeleton inside the cell. They usually determine the shape of the cell, but they also function as a kind of a network guiding everything inside. For example, there's that famous video that went viral a while back that shows us a tiny protein known as kinesin literally walking on microtubules. It sort of resembles this, and this is essentially how a lot of different materials get inside and outside of the cell, which basically makes these microtubules almost like roads inside a typical cell. But apart from structure and guiding things, they obviously do a lot of other things as well. But what makes these structures somewhat unusual is really the fact that they form these very strange cylinders, and actually cylinders that are extremely orderly, that sort of create almost like crystals. And so when Hameroff discovered about microtubules, he realized that they have a very high chance of being responsible for what makes us conscious, or I guess more specifically, for what makes us unconscious during anesthesia. And he even went further and argues that microtubules provide computation inside our brain that can potentially explain consciousness just because of their complexity and their unusual crystallized structure, and because of the sheer number of these structures inside our bodies. And so he actually proposed to Penrose that this was the basic unit of processing inside neurons themselves. Not the connection between neurons, but microtubules inside neurons. And that of course went contrary to a lot of different studies in neuroscience that established neuronal connections as a very important source of pretty much everything inside the brain. Here we're talking about this area known as the synapse that usually releases a lot of neurotransmitters that basically creates communication between neurons, and modern neurobiology has a lot of evidence to suggest that this is very likely the case. And this is of course the idea behind modern computer science and modern artificial intelligence. For example, those language models, they all use the idea of synapses, but basically build them in terms of algorithms, replacing the brain with a kind of a neural network. And so naturally this idea of tubules or microtubules was a very contentious proposition, and pretty much everyone disagreed with it. But it didn't stop Penrose and Hameroff, and they eventually proposed a new concept. They refer to it as orchestrated objective reduction. One of those 20 propositions that try to explain consciousness, but this time through quantum physics, and specifically quantum effects produced inside these microtubules that can sometimes be disrupted by things like anesthesia, as proposed by Hameroff, but overall relies on three main principles. First, these microtubules produce the quantum states, and they're able to produce this because they form these unusual crystalline structures that can somehow produce quantum states inside. It's not really well explained how, but that's beside the point. Second, anesthesia, any anesthesia, is able to affect these quantum states and disrupt them, thus causing unconsciousness. With the third principle being somewhat unusual, it actually relates to quantum states proposed by Penrose, because here it states that gravity also plays a role, and specifically because of the mass interaction, here gravity usually causes the natural collapse of these quantum states, and thus provides consciousness. So yeah, all of this might sound super complicated, and it really is, but if I were to give you a 5-second explanation, it's basically as follows. Brains contain microtubules. Microtubules form complex crystalline structures that can somehow produce quantum states inside of them. Those quantum states create these really large quantum waves inside the brain that collapse for various external reasons that somehow leads to the idea of consciousness. Yeah, sounds kind of eccentric when you put it this way, right? And that's of course what most scientists kind of said. And pretty much everyone ignored this, except for maybe a few scientists, until relatively recently, and specifically until we actually found a way to test this, mostly because experimental procedures became good enough to physically figure out if this is true. And so even though brain is kind of hot and kind of wet, and shouldn't really produce quantum states, some scientists decided to see if microtubules can actually do any of this. And here I guess let's start with some of the more negative experiments. This was actually from 2022, and this is the experimental setup used in this case. And so here a group of Italian physicists conducted an intriguing experiment that tried to see if gravity does actually cause quantum collapse that could then maybe provide evidence for Penrose's and Hameroff's propositions. So basically here they assumed that objects with larger mass are going to have a much faster collapse of the quantum wave function. And this collapse should be accompanied by certain emissions in certain types of light, something that this particular experiment was designed to detect. But they actually found nothing. And so in this case, this quantum wave reduction idea was now believed to be possibly incorrect. And initially, when I was going to make a video about this in 2022, that was basically my conclusion. It's a cool proposition. It tries to use biology, quantum physics, and a lot of other fields to basically combine everything to explain consciousness, but it was more of a thought experiment than anything else. And I'm actually kind of happy I waited to make that video, because now we have practically the opposite evidence. We actually have at least 2 experiments on microtubules that potentially prove something entirely different. And so in one of the experiments in 2023, the scientists wanted to find out one simple thing. Can anesthetics affect microtubules directly, thus possibly providing evidence that there might be something about them in terms of consciousness? Here's actually a physical picture of microtubules inside a typical cell. And here's another picture of different cells connected together and microtubules shown in green. And so for this particular experiment, the scientists took microtubules and they basically made them glow because a lot of them do display fluorescence. But then they decided to test something about this fluorescence. They added certain anesthetics into those microtubules and it surprisingly changed the way they glow. In other words, they actually discovered that a lot of fluorescence seems to have a substantial delay when microtubules are mixed with anesthetics such as, for example, xenon. In this case, the effect is actually really small. The actual delay was only about 20% or so, but it provided important evidence that there is a connection between anesthesia and microtubules. Or in other words, it actually provided important evidence for something that Hameroff proposed back in the 80s. But that doesn't obviously prove anything in regards to quantum mechanics. None of these effects so far are quantum in nature. And that's until we come to this recent paper that as always you can find in the description below. And I guess in some sense, if you watch this whole video, you can probably understand what this title says. Here they used a mega network of tryptophan, or basically once again microtubules, in order to provide first ever evidence for quantum effects. And the reasoning behind the study was somewhat unusual. Here the researchers once again realized that this is a kind of a crystalline structure. A crystal-like biological structure that makes microtubules a very attractive candidate for all sorts of quantum entanglement. And this idea has been previously explored in other papers, but never physically proven. And so here, by using microtubules that you can technically buy online from a lot of different biological companies, the researchers performed a super simple experiment. They used a more complex arrangement of these microtubules and basically made them fluoresce. By shining the UV light, these microtubules started to emit light back. But here, because of the arrangement and because of the structure, they actually started producing super radiance. Very likely caused by the collective interaction inside these arrangements, which results in the production of light as a kind of a high-intensity pulse, different from what's usually expected in classical physics. But this is only something that happens when these molecules are arranged in symmetrical networks, kind of similar to what we usually find in various cells. If you just take a simple tryptophan molecule, or just a few of them, without a specific arrangement, they don't do any of this. And so this unusual quantum effect that produces stronger fluorescence has been now physically proven to exist inside microtubule structures. And by demonstrating that microtubules can indeed produce quantum effects, it creates a kind of an implication for a lot of studies of consciousness. Now, it doesn't actually prove that consciousness is quantum. What it does prove, though, is that it's not impossible. Here we now have physical proof that, first of all, microtubule arrangement can indeed produce quantum effects, and from that previous study, these quantum effects, or really any effects inside these microtubules, can also be affected by a lot of anesthetics, which by itself is a huge discovery for fields like quantum biology. But the main point is really to discover all of the quantum effects in various biological systems. And so if a lot of this is confirmed in future studies, and if many of these studies do discover that maybe consciousness is actually caused by microtubules, and maybe it is quantum in nature, this of course has a huge implication for a lot of fields, and more practically for medical fields. So here, one example that someone mentioned in one of the studies is things like Alzheimer's. There's actually evidence that Alzheimer's, which usually leads to a major breakdown of conscious activity, is very often caused by some kind of a protein buildup and, surprisingly, dissolution of microtubules inside neurons. And not just Alzheimer's, a lot of different types of dementia seem to be connected to microtubules as well. But more importantly, if this is indeed a result of quantum effects, Since we know so much about quantum physics and how all of this is affected by electromagnetic sources, there's even a possibility here for different types of non-invasive therapies, and specifically electromagnetic therapies, that can potentially treat dementia and Alzheimer's and a lot of other cognitive problems by directly affecting quantum effects inside of various microtubules. In other words, these unusual discoveries could potentially lead to a major breakthrough in a lot of different fields of neuroscience. But as of right now, this is still a very big if. Mostly because we only have like 2 studies right now, and a lot of confirmation is first needed to see if maybe some of this is caused by something entirely different, or if maybe there was some kind of a contamination or possibly issues with data collection. And so until we see more similar experiments or even additional experiments with microtubules where other quantum effects can be induced, possibly taking us a little bit closer to this idea of quantum consciousness, we're not really going to be able to tell what exactly is happening here and whether all of this is correct or not. But these initial discoveries from the last couple of years are currently super exciting, because for all we know, maybe Penrose and Hameroff were actually correct, and maybe it's all because of microtubules, with these unusual structures playing an even more important role inside our bodies. On that note, once we have some updates, or once someone else discovers something else exciting about microtubules, we'll come back and talk more about this, because this is a super important discovery. And so until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon by joining channel membership, or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.